Hi, welcome to another video from Writing ELT Materials. This is the first video of 2024, so look out for more. As you know, Writing ELT Materials got started in 2023. We've run some courses. We've provided resources on our website at writingeltmaterials.com. If you're interested in any of that, I'll talk a little bit more about our plans for 2024 at the end of this video. The real reason for watching this is to meet Sandy Millin. Many of you may know Sandy. She has written this: a competency framework for language learning materials writing, and it really is an excellent document. It's one of the first and successful attempts to define what it is we do as materials writers and to get us thinking about what are the skills we need to develop. Anyway, let's go talk to Sandy about it, find out what it's about, how she wrote it, why she thinks it's useful.
I'm Sandy Millin. I'm a freelance trainer. I'm a freelance ELT consultant, methodology editor, and I'm also an IATEFL ambassador. And I run my own Cambridge Delta Take Your Time Module 1 and Module 3 courses. And I've also recently finished my MA dissertation.
Which brings us to one of the end products of your dissertation, which is this document, which
it's beautiful. That's the first time I've seen it printed.
Well, it was on my screen, but I like to have a printed copy because I have already started referring to it in terms of thinking about training teachers to write materials. But also what I found when I was going through, I started reading the list of competencies and I thought, okay, yes, I can do that and that. Oh, I'm not so good at that. Or, oh, I wouldn't have included that in materials writing. I could see what, and so it's as a reflective document. It's just genuinely really interesting.
That's amazing. That's brilliant.
I only have my one minor complaint, which I'm going to begin with and get out of the way. In the introduction, your sentence says, this competency framework is designed to draw together all the knowledge, skills, and abilities which may be needed to write effective materials for language learning. My gripe with that sentence is the modal verb. Yeah. I think it draws together all the knowledge, skills, and abilities which you must have in order to write effective materials, because I think you've got a very complete framework here. I don't think there's any may about it, but maybe you want to explain that wording.
That's very good feedback. I think it's because nothing like that exists and I made it by myself. I wanted to be a little bit tentative so that nobody would come back and say, but you didn't think about this. So that's actually really good feedback.
You were just hedging.
Okay. You feel it's that comprehensive. That's very good feedback.
Well, I didn't read through it and think, oh, this is missing or that's missing. I can see how things might develop in the future that we need to bring in, but we can talk about that in a minute. So it's a competency framework for language learning, materials writing, not specifically English language. It could be used by any language learning teacher or materials writer, presumably. Exactly. Just give us the background about it. How did you, what is it? Why did you write it? It was part of a dissertation? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I was looking for a topic for my dissertation. I was doing the MA with Niall, and doing a dissertation was the scariest thing for me because I had never done anything like that before. And so I wanted something that I was going to be interested enough in that I was going to be able to keep working on it for 18 months. And I was inspired by Denise Santos. She did a talk at IATEFL Belfast in 2022. And she was talking about being a materials writer, but feeling like there was no framework for her professional development. There was no particular guidance for her professional development. And her talk was called something like In Search of a Framework for CPD. So that's what I started off with, the idea that materials writing didn't have a CPD framework. Teachers have them. For example, there's British Council one, there's Cambridge one, English Australia have one. There's lots and lots of frameworks for teachers for development. There are some for trainers, again, British Council, Cambridge. There's also one for managers that's come out relatively recently in the last 2 or 3 years, Equals Academic Management Competency Framework. But there's nothing for materials writing, even though it's a huge part of ELT. And in some ways, it's kind of a bedrock of ELT because the materials that we use in the classroom govern a lot of what teachers do. They govern a lot of how teachers do it. They govern a lot of what it is the learners learn, because it's although it's possible to go beyond the materials, teachers don't often have time to do that or the freedom to do that. They're told these are the materials that you have to use. And so I think it was something that I read in some of your writing, John, that you were talking about how much it's trial and error that teachers learn how to do materials writing. And I thought, if it's so important, if the materials are so important, but we're learning it completely by accident, as it were, there's something missing. And so that's what I felt this competency framework would do, is give that guidance for how do we develop those skills? How do we know what to work on? How do we guide others in developing those skills? So that's why this framework. In terms of how I developed it, so I started off by talking to somebody who'd worked on one of the other competency frameworks that I mentioned. So I talked to them about the process of putting together a competency framework. One of the big things I learned was you should do it in a team, but I couldn't do that because I was doing a dissertation, so I had to work alone. But in order to get in as many voices as possible, I ran a questionnaire. So I got about 120 people responded to the questionnaire with their ideas about what knowledge, skills, abilities you might need for materials writing. And then I took the questionnaire results and some of the people who responded to that, and they then participated in focus groups. So I ran 6 focus groups where people talked through some of the ideas I had for the competencies, the ideas to go into the competency framework. In parallel to that, I also analysed other competency frameworks, so some of the ones that I mentioned, and I looked at what does a framework look like? How is it laid out? What kind of language is used? How is it broken down? And I put all of that together along with a lot of background reading to work out, to kind of synthesize all of that into those skills. And in the background reading, I was cursing a certain John Hughes for writing too much stuff in too little time and making my references really complicated.
Sorry.
I think I ended up with Hughes 2022G because you wrote so much stuff in 2022. Thank you. It was very useful.
Well, it's interesting because I attended one of your focus groups, and at the time there was so much in there that we didn't have time to sort of talk through and discuss. So what was fascinating for me, because when I looked at it, I thought, crikey, Sandy's got a lot in here. How is she going to because at the time it was a sort of screen of ideas that we were looking at. And it was like, how is she going to I can see it's all there somewhere, but how are you going to piece it into this sort of coherent structure that's actually usable? And you've done it really successfully. There's various parts in the framework, but clearly there's basically 3 sections. If you can just describe to us the sort of structure, and I'm just going to scroll through, so it's kind of giving everybody an overview of what they'll find when they see this framework. We'll be giving a link at the end so you can download it and look at it in detail. But it's basically got 3 main sections, hasn't it? So here we're looking at section 1, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So there are 3 main sections. They're color-coded, so if you print it out, you can see where you are quite easily. So the first section is background knowledge. That one covers kind of all of the information you might need to know to write materials. The creating materials section, that one's more the practical skills for the materials themselves.
I think people will be probably specifically interested in the creating materials, the middle section, because a lot of people who watch these videos are already writers with their experienced teachers. So they'll be familiar with a lot of part 1. Part 2 is interesting, I think, as a materials writer, because you scan through and it's looking at things like activity design, which I thought was a really interesting section. How you define what activity design requires.
Yes.
It's all that sort of checklist of you need to write rubrics, aims, choice of topics. It's a really substantial kind of section.
And so the thinking behind the three sections, behind the background knowledge, the creating materials, the professional skills, is exactly that. So you can, if you want to, you can focus in on one section, or other sections might be less important to you. So if you are a professional materials writer, for example, then the professional skills might be more important to you than if you are still in the classroom and you're creating materials for your own classroom. The background knowledge section, that one's building up your, you might be aware of some of those things, but you might not be aware of all of them. So for example, there's a section right at the beginning about starting with the learner, analysing the learner needs. And I think when we think about needs analysis, quite often we might focus on what they want to do in the classroom, for example, or we might focus on the activities that they enjoy, for example. But the framework goes beyond that, and it actually breaks it down into 11 different areas. And it includes things like how the learners prefer to interact with information. So do they like to, like John's printed out the framework, for example, do you prefer to have it on paper? Do you prefer to have it as digital materials, for example? Yeah. So it's trying to get people to kind of go deeper, go beyond what they're already doing, and to keep pushing their knowledge in all of these different areas. I thought that's, yeah, I was going to say, and that's the same with the creating materials. So we think about creating aims, for example, but how do you then break that down? Like, what are the sub skills of creating aims?
Yeah, and I think that's challenging. And I thought also in a sense, the framework also reflects a teacher's development in many ways. The first section will be particularly of interest to people still in the classroom full time, maybe starting out creating their own materials. Maybe they're at a diploma level. They're at that sort of, and they're thinking about, needs analysis, designing specific materials for my learners in my context. And then section 2, and then particularly section 3, when it gets onto professional skills, it's sort of like, okay, now you're thinking of moving into the area of creating materials that are going to be published, used by other teachers. And it's sort of, as you read through, it sort of reflects those steps to some extent. And I think if you're newer to teacher, there'll be more in section 1 initially, and then you'll start looking into section 2. And if you're already a materials writer, with some years experience, you'll probably look at section 1 and think, yeah, most of there's things in there that are still important, like you talk about, diversity, inclusion, these kinds of issues that come up, but a lot of it is section 2, section 3. Interestingly, I thought section 3 is probably the section that if you were thinking about the future for this framework, it's the section that's actually going to be changing the most. I mean, you touch on use of digital tools and stuff. Inevitably, AI is going to have greater impact on what we do, thinking about generating ideas with it, curating materials, the sort of supervisory side of materials writing. And it's also interesting because I think it strays into the area of editing. You have a section on checking your work. Can you edit your writing? Can you proofread it? Is it factually accurate? Can you work with editors to improve the writing? Actually, I mean, that section, it's sort of about self-editing, but it's traditionally a lot of the skills that an editor, you just would have sent the stuff and said, editor, sort it out. And increasingly, that's not the case. Writers need to develop those editorial skills and those sort of editing, writing skills. I mean, I know you do editing and writing, and they're sort of morphing into each other to some extent. And that third section, I think, for anybody in that stage of their materials writing career and so on, would be particularly interesting.
I think that's really interesting, listening to you talk about how you interpret the 3 stages, because for me, I thought within each section, it goes from the teacher to the professional materials writer, kind of internally within the sections, which was part of my thinking with the order that I put things in. So, for example, in section 3 with the professional skills, I started off with the writing skills because I thought those things about clarity, for example, conveying information about the language and skills clearly. If you're writing a worksheet for your students, or if you're I think creating PowerPoints. So people often don't think of PowerPoints as materials, but they absolutely are. The materials that a lot of teachers base their teaching around, those are language learning materials. And what people do sometimes when they're creating those materials is they overcomplicate the information about the language, the information about the skills that they're putting in there. And so I think having that idea of, can I actually convey that information clearly? Can I convey it clearly when I put it onto the whiteboard? I think that's a basic teaching skill, for example, and that's the very first competency in the professional skills section. Or things like editing your writing, proofreading your writing. Again, I think those are key in the classroom. And if you're a professional materials writer, to some extent, the editor might help you with that or work around that. But it's also designed for people who are self-published. It's designed for people who don't have necessarily that support network, and to encourage them, for example, with 3.1B is checking your work, and then B5 is seeking feedback, encouraging people to test out materials with their colleagues, for example, within a school. So, we're teaching together. I create some materials and I say, John, could you try these out in your classroom? Do they work for your students as well as they work for mine? And so that was part of my thinking in terms of the organisation within each section is, what would a teacher need? Put that first, because those are kind of the bedrock skills or competencies that you need. Working through towards the end, what is it more likely that you're only going to be doing as a professional materials writer? So, for example, the very final section of the professional skills is working with publishers. So what are the skills that are different if you're working to somebody else's requirements compared to working to your own requirements for your classroom, for example? So that's some of my thinking there.
You have a really nice section near the beginning on how to use the framework, where you kind of give case study teachers on, what a different teacher might use. So we've got somebody who's a new teacher, somebody who's already a materials writer professional, somebody who's recruiting for a school, somebody venturing into self-publishing. I mean, they're really nice illustrations of how the document might be used. Did you get that idea from looking at other frameworks, or you just came up with that yourself?
No, I did not come up with that myself. That was one of the things that I got from looking at other frameworks. So I think the main place that I got that from was the equals frameworks, okay. And particularly the management framework. They had these really nice case studies about how different managers might use it. And I think that management framework, because it's the most recent framework, I think that's probably one of the ones that influenced my thinking quite a lot in terms of how to structure the framework and how to make it usable. Because some of the older frameworks I found, when I was looking at it, I was thinking, I can understand what these competencies are, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Or I don't know how I'm supposed to actually use the framework, like access the framework. But what I found with the equals management, academic management competency framework, was that just having those case studies at the beginning really helped me to understand how the creators thought it might be used and to give me different ideas for how it could be used. And then when I was reading up more about competency frameworks, they're very common in large companies to create competency frameworks for specific positions or specific types of position. And they're often used to structure professional development, to structure interviews and career progression. And so people kind of work their way through the competencies within a structure within the organization. And I think that giving those ideas about how you could work your way through the framework, I felt when I was reading frameworks made them a bit less overwhelming, and saying to me that what it said to me was, you don't have to be able to do all of this straight away. And I think that's the danger with a framework like this. You look at it, you see I think it's 18 pages of competencies, and you go, oh my God, no way, that's never going to happen. But I think by having the case studies, you can say it's okay. You don't need to use the whole thing. You can just focus in on a section of it, whatever interests you. If you are, if you're John's stage in your career, you can look through it and go, okay, yes, I can do that. No, I can't. But if you're a brand new teacher, you can just pick an area that you want to focus on and choose one or two things that you'd like to develop in your own materials writing, rather than going, I have to understand all of it, or there's no point writing materials.
But I think that comes across really clear in the document. It doesn't fit. I mean, I've seen competency frameworks like this that are like the size of a book, and you just think, oh, crikey, I don't have time for that. Whereas this is, quite short to the point. And it comes across that you're not expected to do it. I mean, it's that classic thing when I read through, it was raising issues of things that I'm sure I used to be quite good at and I've kind of forgotten, or you're mentioning knowledge of theories of something and I'm thinking, yeah, I read that book years ago. And so I think for anybody, it's a really, it's either a reminder or it's a raising issue. But I don't think there's a sense of reading it of, I've got to be able to do all of these things. And certainly anybody looking at this document shouldn't feel like that in a sense. And in many ways, for more experienced writers, it's just a reminder of things, and it makes you think about things. Well, I should go off and kind of develop that. And then for certainly in terms of schools, recruitment, teacher training, teacher development, I mean, the provision to develop materials writing skills is so poor within ELT, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes,
agreed. It never forms a part of basic teacher training, that this actually provides training providers with a sort of a checklist of things they ought to be thinking about, some of which they'll include, but not specifically with a focus on materials writing.
Yeah.
So it has all of that. And just anybody who writes and so on, I think will find it interesting. In terms of future plans, what's next? What do you want people to do with this, because they can access this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's available on my blog, and we'll give you the link at the end so that you can access it. It very specifically says version 1.0. So when I was reading about how other people have developed competency frameworks, one of the big things that people needed to do was pilot them, as you should with any good materials. I was not able to pilot the framework within the scope of my dissertation. So I'm kind of in the piloting phase right now. So that's what I would like people to do, is try it out, use it, tell me if there's anything you feel is missing, if there's anything you feel is confusing, if there's anything you feel like is in the wrong place, for example, because it's based around a lot of research, but ultimately it's my idea about how to put it all together. It was me that decided which competencies went into which categories and which categories went into which sections and all of this. So when you follow the link, when you see the framework itself, there's an email address where you can send me feedback. So that's one of the things that I would like to do. Another thing that I would like to do down the line is work with people to see how we create the training that goes with the framework. So it's all well and good telling people that you need to develop your knowledge of intercultural competence, for example. Okay, but how? And I think having guidance on how to develop those skills is something that I would also like to do. It's something that with their teaching framework, English Australia have a teaching framework. And if you're an English Australia member, you can log into their area and choose specific areas of the framework that you would like to work on, and access training relevant to that section of the framework. Now, I don't know if that's something that I will ever be able to achieve by myself, but if anybody wants to work with me on it, I would be very happy to do that, because I think that the framework is kind of the first step in creating those tools, but you need to give people the practical access to how to develop those skills. So I said, these are the skills. Now, what do you do with that?
Right. I think it's a brilliant document. We'll be posting the video on YouTube, but we'll share it. We'll make sure the link is all over the place where people go to download the document. And obviously anybody can contact you or me if there's a problem getting hold of it. It'll be really interesting to see the feedback that comes and find out how people are using it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been really interesting listening to you talk about how you've been using it already as well, because that's something that I would like to know is how useful is it? How practical is it? Because for me,
in terms of us and delivering training and supporting teachers, it's already been interesting just to compare what we've been doing with what's in the document and what's listed in the framework and what are we covering. And other courses already do certain things, particularly in section 1 in terms of the understanding of the classroom and so on. That's what I mean in terms of that's already provided for by courses like CELTAs, DELTAs, and so on. But as you say, there are other things in there that probably need to be addressed that aren't addressed on training courses.
Yeah, and I think it's also making that explicit connection with the background knowledge, with the teaching things, making the explicit connection between that knowledge and materials. So I think that was the important thing in background knowledge in 1.1. B3 says can understand how relevant areas above might influence the target learner's language learning and their use of language learning materials. So it's taking that knowledge that you have from teaching and then applying it to the materials. And I think, again, that's kind of a key thing that people don't always make that connection between.
I thought it was also interesting you have certain things about, understanding of theories and so on. And then, of course, there's section 2, which is about the actual creating materials. And then that throws up that whole can of worms of, well, this is the theory and that's the practice. And do we reflect the theory in our activities? And does actually the theory, can it be turned into materials? So there's that whole can of worms, but that's another video.
Exactly.
Anyway, thanks so much for talking to me, Sandy. That was brilliant.
Thank you for inviting me, John.
Okay, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that the link to this document is below the video. And also a reminder that in 2024, Writing ELT Materials will be running more of its courses. We'll be doing an intensive course in June. We'll be running our usual 10-week course towards the end of September. And we'll have some events coming up in 2024, including we'll be at ITEFL. We'll be launching a scholarship program we're going to run to help people to take our future courses. And we'll also be providing more blog posts on our A to Z of materials writing at writingeltmaterials.com. Go take a look at the website and keep in touch with us on LinkedIn.